really encourage everyone to have a mindset of this is our budget. We are citizens of the Bahamas. We care about this country. We care about the future of the country. And the reason why org is so interested in making sure that Bahamians have accurate information about the budget, not just the, why we do it, but it's so that everybody can have buy-in and we can all see like we are understanding what it is that the government's doing on our behalf. Remember, we're taxpayers. We are also responsible for how our resources are spent. And so I just want to say that at the outset. So thank you for being here, and let's get on with it. Ari? So I think just some of the couple of slides we just skipped over, but just to put it in context for org, being a civil society and a civic-minded group, the idea is to have transparency around issues that touch all of our lives. And so that's why org is doing this. That's why we exist. That's why I'm a board member and I'm vested in every Bahamian having as much information as possible. So just a quick introduction to the budget. Why does it matter? Why do we even care about it? And as I said, if you think about what's happening in the US today and the amount of attention that the US budget got, this should give you a sense of why every Bahamian ought to be interested in the budget, because the policies do matter, how the government arrives at those policies matter, and because it's going to affect each and every one of us, either in higher taxation or maybe lower taxation in some cases. The direction of the policies matter in terms of being able to see the trajectory that the government is heading the country in, and then we get to assess whether or not it makes sense for us as citizens of the country. Next slide. So so the government budget, why is it everyone's business? And I think it's everyone's business because, as I said at the outset, we're paying taxes. We are citizens. We all have concerns, whether you care about the environment, whether you care about the vulnerable communities like disabled persons, whether you care about what's happening with our major economic driver, which is tourism, and our stake in it, whether you care about family island development. This is really, really, really why it's everybody's business, because we all care. We all care. We want good roads. We want a safe environment. We want to be assured that the police, when we need them, are available and they are properly resourced. So it's everyone's business. Next slide. So if you think about the government budget as being the core of public sector governance, because of what I just said, it's where the government takes in all the resources that it can from tax revenue, but it really is sort of like the focal point, the driver that sets the tone for the way the public sector behaves, the way civil society behaves, the way citizens behave. And if we don't have resources, and by that I mean, if we show up at the PMH and we need a particular procedure, or we need to get through the emergency room quickly and those resources aren't available, there's an immediate impact. So paying attention to health budget, paying attention to the kinds of schools that exist, and so on, our roads being paved, against security, which is on everybody's minds because of crime and violence, all of these things at the center of all of these outcomes is where the government's budget and how it's allocated across various sectors will affect all of these very important concerns that we as Bahamians have. So next one. What all would like is that every Bahamian is not just well informed about what it is that the budget is, how it's presented, why it's presented in a particular way, why it's important for every Bahamian, but because, as I mentioned, we all have a stake, so we ought to be concerned. I think Bahamian society is really good at commenting on events that happen over the course of a given year, and we're immediately affected by good things that happen and bad things that happen. But remember, the narrative that we're getting from whether it's public announcements or when we see our public officials on television during evening news or in the newspaper because they deem that it's something that they're doing is important, they're feeding us a narrative that sometimes feels extremely accurate, meaning, what is being described and what they are doing, we can all relate to, or it seems very out of touch. So I think one of the ways in which we can become more active citizens in terms of being able to critique what's going on in the country is by understanding what the government's doing with our resources. And everyone has a sense that they would like to be an agent of change. And I think that's why these kinds of conversations are important. So what is the national budget to begin with? Next slide. So the budget essentially, think about it like this. If budget by definition scares you, think about your own individual budgets, right? Every household, every home, every head of a household, every institution, whether it's private, whether it's public, whether it's a non-governmental organization, we all start with a budget because it allows us to figure out what I can do, what I can't do, what I have resources for. Maybe I need to save more for that holiday that I'd really like to take, or I have school fees coming up in September. I need to allocate enough savings so that when it's time to make provision for those school fees, I've got it. So it's basically what a budget is. A budget is basically saying, what am I doing with the income I have? And how can I stay within my income? Of course, you can borrow money. You're going to borrow money maybe to buy a big purchase like a car or some expensive new renovation on your house, or even to build a house and so on. Those things you generally borrow for. And the government is no different. The government earns a set amount of income and it has a set amount of expenditures, and then it needs to allocate those expenditures across the entire needs of the country. And so this is why it's important to think about the government's budget in terms of what is it investing in, how is it taking care of its normal expenditures. So for example, we know that lots of people work for the government. So those salaries have to be paid every month. And the government is not in a position to say, oh, well, you know what, we don't have enough money this month to pay your salary, we're not going to pay you. No, those salaries, like interest payments on debt, tend to come up first. And those things are what I call, and what economists call, rigid expenditures. Can't really change them from month to month because you can't fire people this week because it's not that easy to do. So we need to be earning enough revenue to pay for these, what I call the rigid expenditures, those things that we are committed to doing. And then there are other things that the government can do. Next slide. So if you think about the budget in this way, I already made the analogy to a household budget, which is what I earn in my salary and what I need to pay out in terms of buy groceries every week, I've got a mortgage payment, or I pay rent, or I've got school fees, I've got car payments. So it is very similar. The government, because it's larger and it has a whole lot of things to be concerned about. Some of the things I mentioned earlier: education, transportation, meaning roads and our airports and so on, hospitals, doctors, nurses, all of the people that work for the government, schools. Think about all of the assets that the government owns. Those assets need to be maintained. We need to be looking after them. That's where the budget is going. It's going to be allocated across all of those sectors. And the revenues that the government receives come from taxes. Now, typically, when we talk about government budgets, we tend to put it in perspective relative to the amount of income that the entire economy produces, gross domestic product, or GDP. So when you see governments present their budgets, and it doesn't matter which country it is, it's usually denominated as a share of GDP. So wages as a share of GDP. Typically, IMF will say you want to keep that between 8% of GDP and 10% of GDP, no more or no less. Debt to GDP, that's a very important number. For a country like the Bahamas, our debt to GDP ideally should be around 60% of GDP. Currently, it's around 80 plus percent of GDP. So these are some things to keep in mind, because whatever the country is earning, that denominator, that will allow us some perspective on how much the government should be growing its budget. So GDP, if it's increasing very fast, let's say it's growing by, typically a good rate of increase for GDP is 3% every year in real terms. If it's growing by that amount, it means that, okay, there is room for the government then to increase its spending or try to increase its revenue as a share of, or as quickly as GDP is growing. So this is why when you see IMF reports or reports from international reports on government spending and so on, it's usually as a fraction of what the gross domestic product is in a particular country in a specific time frame. Next slide. So, mentioned earlier, what are some of the sources of government revenue? So government, like us, I earn or you earn a salary, or you also have savings and you have investments. So those are your sources of revenue. Similar, the government has similar sources of revenue. In this case, the main source of revenue are taxes. In the Bahamas, everybody's familiar with VAT because it's an indirect tax. Custom duties, these are the two main forms of revenues in the Bahamas, but there are also direct taxes like real property taxes, business license fees, and a host of other fees that you encounter from time to time when you're doing business with the government. Fees and licenses, for example. You go to license a car, there's a fee attached to that. Dividends from state-owned enterprises, assuming they are earning dividends, because some state-owned enterprises actually don't make money. Some of them are rely on subsidies from governments. But to the extent to which we do have state-owned enterprises that are profitable, then we earn dividends from them. The government also gets resources from grants and aid through technical assistance programs, whether it's through multilateral institutions or bilateral institutions, and countries that do business with us and want to help in some ways. And then, of course, this is a large category of borrowing. And here is where I draw the analogy to big investments that the government would undertake. For example, if the government wants to build a new airport, build a new school, build a hospital, it typically doesn't dip into revenues to do that. What it would do is it would borrow to do that. So for example, you and I would borrow to buy a house, or to extend our house, or to buy a new car. We generally don't go in and just plunk down whatever it costs for a new car. We would either finance that through a bank, or if we are buying a new house, we'd get a mortgage. So those borrowings that the government does, they borrow from the domestic market, which would mean all of the banks and financial institutions within the country, or domestic borrowing can also take the form of government bonds or treasury bills. And you see that, every now and then you see in the newspaper that, a treasury bond a bond is being issued, and they're asking people to enter the auction for that. So these are the borrowing tends to supplement, well, not tends, but it supplements whatever revenue is coming in order to finance the total expenditures of the government in any given year. So if, for example, let's say this year total expenditures were $150, but revenues were only $100, then that extra 50 would be financed from either borrowing or from a grant or from aid. But generally, it's mostly borrowing in the case of the Bahamas, because remember, the Bahamas is an upper middle income country. It does not qualify for a lot of concessional financing from some institutions. And in fact, we've been graduated from an institution like the World Bank, for example, which means that institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank tends to be one of the sources of multilateral financing that the Bahamas takes advantage of quite frequently. And that's a very good relationship. Next slide. So who's responsible for the government, for the budget? I think we all know the answer to that. The primary responsibility is the Ministry of Finance. This is all very much embedded in our laws and also in financial fiscal responsibility legislation that the Bahamas has. So the Ministry of Finance, they're the ones that produce the budget document. They're the ones when we pay our taxes, it goes into the consolidated fund by the Ministry of Finance. All the revenues that get collected across all the different sectors of the economy goes to the Ministry of Finance. So they are basically the fiduciary managers of the government's resources. Next slide. So, so what happens when a budget call is made is that the Ministry of Finance, I don't know how it's done today, but it used to be done this way. There would be a call, there would, something would go out to all the ministries to say, please submit your budget requests, and the budget then is aggregated based on all of the various input that's received from the ministries. So education, health, public works, on and on and on. Those submissions come into the Ministry of Finance, and then this is where the officials, the technicians at the Ministry of Finance need to look at what was spent last year based on what that ministry had requested in the previous year. Did they spend it all? Sometimes, and this is not just in the Bahamas, across a lot of countries, you often get ministries padding budgets because in a sense, they know that once it hits the Ministry of Finance, it could be that, things get chopped. So sometimes those budgets look a little bit inflated, but really good budgets are ones where the finance ministry would already set out some very strict parameters. So for example, if the economy only grew by 1% last year, it's highly unlikely that you will see that a ministry would send, Ministry of Finance would send out notices to ministries and not give them guidance around, please, keep the budget within X, keep it within Y, because we need to reach this particular target on the deficit. And we're going to get more into that a little bit later. But why that's important is because of what I mentioned earlier. The total revenues collected by the government in any one given year, most of the time, it's insufficient to cover all of the needs of the various ministries, plus the needs of the government itself. And when I say that, think about, again, go back to first principles around rigid expenditures. Money that we've borrowed in the past, which is accruing interest, so our stock of debt, means that we have debt service on that stock of debt every year. Those payments have to come, those requests come in for those debts to be repaid. It tends to be, not tends to be, but it almost always is, those bills get paid on time, every time. And the reason for that is any slippage would cause the Bahamas to be in default. And of course, the Bahamas government, successive governments, have a very good reputation of always paying its debts on time. We've never defaulted on an external debt. I don't think we've ever defaulted on a domestic debt either. But it's really important that for the reputation of the country, and then this comes up in the context of when we apply for credit ratings, for example, if we are late on repaying external debt, or if we miss a payment, God forbid we ever have to do that because things are tough, that causes signals to go off, not just in the creditors, meaning those who we borrowed the money from, banks or bondholders. If bondholders don't receive their dividends on time, on the schedule that is allotted for when we purchase those bonds, those are all bad signals. So the things that get paid first, salaries of civil servants and debt service, these two things are probably the most important. And then after that, of course, if we start to pass the budget in terms of which ministry is getting resources first, there tends to be a hierarchy, meaning education and health tend to be the two top ones for obvious reasons. We care about our children. We care about getting good results in education. We have a lot of children in schools. We have a lot of schools that need to be properly maintained. And we have a lot of teachers that need to be paid. So teachers, doctors, nurses, hospitals, clinics. And if you look at even the most recent budget announcements, these two categories are tend to get a lot of air with finance officials. So here, the national priorities, when we talk about national priorities and how they get established, obviously between administrations, various ministers of finance will have national priorities that they've set. And so, when I read the budget communication that was issued a few weeks ago, it's clear that this budget was very supportive of, in my opinion, of vulnerable groups. It tried to allocate resources around areas that are important to the Bahamas in terms of improving tourism, aviation, health in terms of new hospitals and clinics and so on. There was a lot of tax relief for some parts of the society. There was also a lot of support for small, medium enterprises. So those would be the national priorities that this administration has set. And so we see that coming out very clearly in the budget. Now, the aspect of it supporting, enabling forecasting is a really important notion because, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, if the Ministry of Finance has sent out really good instructions to various ministries, it's because they've done their homework. And what do I mean by that? The Bahamas is not living in isolation. The Bahamas is part of a global environment. So what are the things that are important here? What's happening with our trading partners? How fast is the global economy growing? How fast is the US economy growing? How fast is Canada growing? Because these two countries in particular are major source markets for tourism. So if those countries, if there's any hint that there's going to be a slight recession, then we start to get worried. And by the way, you may have heard already the Minister of Tourism and Deputy Prime Minister announce fairly early on that we may have to be thinking about contingencies because tourism could enter into a soft period because of a slowdown in the US economy. So these are the kinds of nuts and bolts considerations the technicians of the Ministry of Finance would be working through when they put up budgets. And I'm seeing some reactions from the audience because today I think like a lot of you who are following the news in the US, it's very concerning that the US, the budget that was presented and passed today is basically going to vastly increase the debt of the US government. And it's, in my mind, it's a budget that is particularly punishing for low and middle income groups. And so I think, empirical evidence suggests that trickle-down economics has not worked in the past. So giving tax relief to the highest income brackets rarely does it translate into higher growth. And there's a lot of economic evidence around this. I think the signal for the Bahamas is that the US could go into a recession, despite the fact that the labor report today suggested that 137,000 new jobs were found in June, and that unemployment is remaining pretty steady. But I think we ought to be very concerned about watching the prospects for the US economy because of tourism. And on that note, I would say that the Ministry of Tourism probably is in a position right now to say, hold on, what can we adjust and how can we maybe start advertising to other markets, not just the US market. So just on the budget process and the stages, talked about the pre-preparation, the budget formulation, how that's done, enactment, what happens in Parliament, once it's tabled, and then the proof of the pudding, of course, is implementation. So we've all, over the years, seen announcements by various governments. However, it's not until the end of the year where we sort of go back and say, well, did they do what we said they would allocate X for Y? Did that actually happen? And here is where I think organizations like ORG and where and more aware Bahamian citizens can, start to monitor and say, okay, are those things actually being done? For example, this budget again had a lot about renewable energy. So we need to follow the money there. Is it going to happen or not? Can you, in a year's time, are we still relying on fossil fuels the way we are today? And if those renewable energy projects are materializing, where are they materializing, and how is it impacting? How is it impacting us, but also how is it impacting the communities where it's supposed to be taking place? So I think this is where it's important for Bahamians to pay attention and ask the right questions. And of course, I think, like everybody, a budget gets announced in June. We don't think about it until 6 months later when they do the midterm budget, and then the presentation is made, and then excuses may be made for why this didn't happen or that didn't happen. I think, the trickiest part about any budget for any government in any country, of course, is external factors. We don't know when those shocks are coming. But in the case of the Bahamas right now, I think we can start to prepare, because the shock coming to the US economy, I think, is pretty obvious. And there we just have to step back and say, okay, if this happens, and it seems like there's a strong likelihood that there will be a recession, then what does it mean? And it's not just the budget of the US government, it's also, the whole tariff policy and all of that. And these are the factors that policymakers have to always have in their back pockets. They may not share it with the public, but there always needs to be a contingency plan. So you always hope that the Ministry of Finance officials are, every month looking at what's come in, what I have to spend, and saying, oh, you know what, guys, we didn't hit the target this month, or we didn't hit the target this quarter, we're going to have to pull back. And on this note about pulling back, I mentioned where we cannot pull back. You don't pull back on salaries. You don't pull back, well, generally you don't pull back on salaries, because some countries have had to pull back on salaries if the going got too tough. But what typically happens is the part of the budget that will take a hit may be the capital budget, because infrastructure works can be delayed, can be slowed down, and so on. That tends to be where governments tend to make those first cuts. Okay, so I think this is a space we need to watch really, really carefully. Next slide. Okay, evaluation. Again, what is statutorily required in our legislation is that by the 6 month mark, there needs to be a mid-year accounting and review of the budget and a presentation. We had that. We saw the government produce that earlier this year. I think it was in February when the mid-year report came out. And that tends to give you a good sense of, okay, how far off are we? And so what you see in those presentations are things like, we are now at 75% of the budget allocation for spending on health or whatever it is. And that gives you a good sense of, okay, we're on track. If we're not on track, there tends to be in that communication some indication of what is going to adjust. And again, sometimes, depending on how much deviation there is from the rules, and remember, under our responsibility law, if there are going to be very substantial changes and if certain targets are not going to be met, the government must, or the administration in power must come to Parliament and present and request a supplementary budget, and that needs to be approved in Parliament. So it's a good opportunity every 6 months to see where we're at. If things aren't working out, why is it not working out? It's also a time for us to, as Bahamians, to say, okay, this doesn't make any sense what's happening here. Why are they spending all that money on X versus Y? We think it should be going a different direction. And here, I think citizens in small countries have more voice than they actually use. Because we're small and because it's easy to communicate your distress or your concern or whatever it is, there are various ways to do that. We all have MPs, we know the ministers, some of them we're related to. We need to be communicating to our officials that, hold on, this doesn't appear to be working. Why are you doing it that way? And a responsible government will be responsive to the needs of its citizens. And I think that's part of this process of getting citizens to a point where they have voice. Now, not all things are easy to change, to change, obviously. Some things we can't not do, like we must pay those external creditors. We have to pay salaries. We want to keep the police running because we want to be safe. There are some things that we need to have, but we want to be careful that all of that, what I call discretionary spending that the government may find itself doing, and whether it's thinking about participating in so many external organizations or attending many functions around the world. Some of those functions around the world we absolutely need to be at because we want to make our voices heard. And here I can think of things like COP, the climate conference, which happens every 2 years or every year. Those kinds of places where small countries need to really have a strong voice. Our UN representation, I think that's really important because these are issues where small countries on a big stage really need to have their voices heard. So again, evaluating where we are every 6 months is really important. Assessing how we're doing relative to what the government said it would do. And by the way, I think here is where we really have to give credit to our Ministry of Finance officials, because I think the transparency with which information is being shared, I think is much better than it was, 20 years ago. But it can still be better. And it's up to every Bahamian to keep demanding that information. And by that, I mean things like we need our statistics to be published on time. We need to know when the inflation data is coming out with certainty. We need to know from month to month where we stand on certain data. If the government is contracting new debt, we need to know why and for what. And we need to know who those creditors are. We need to know why are we borrowing from, I'm just using this hypothetically, why are we borrowing from Credit Suisse, which may be charging a market rate, as opposed to using our membership in organizations like the IDB or the World Bank to get slightly more concessional, well, not slightly more, but concessional financing from those institutions. So especially if we're talking about financing infrastructure and development projects. Next slide. So, being able to present this information tonight in a way that's clear and having this information available on the org website, we hope is going to be one of those first steps in helping every Bahamian feel that they're part of the process, but also understand it better. So transparency, the data comes out on a certain date, it's due on a certain date. If it's not available on that date, it hasn't been published. Why hasn't it been published? We need to ask those questions. But also, only through our ability to understand and absorb the data will we be able to critically say whether we're making progress or whether we're not. And part of the transparency and part of fiscal transparency is to not just make sure that whatever the government's doing is in daylight, to put it mildly, but it's also to help everyone understand why things are being done a certain way, why it takes this long for something to get done. And then we can start to be a little more critical in our not just understanding, but in the way in which we approach whatever information we're being fed. So for example, I talked about the narrative that's controlled by what we read in the newspaper, what we're seeing on TV and so on, what the government puts out there. But we also need to be able to use that information in a critical way. And for businesses, and this is really important, for the investment community, for investors, not having accurate information on a timely basis is really bad for planning. So it's just like anything else. if I'm thinking about starting a business, or if I'm thinking about buying a new house or renovating my house, there's some things that I'm going to think about. One is, what is my tax bill this year? Have property taxes gone up? How much disposable income do I have? Do I have any savings for this? And what is the general environment? Am I about to lose my job? Is the economic environment in the Bahamas one where I feel confident that if I were to step out and start this new business, I'll be making money? And so these are decisions that the business community is making every single day, if not, all the time, about should they invest more? Should they take in more inventory? Should they build a new whatever? And it's not just external investors. It's not just international investors we're concerned about. We should be concerned about domestic investors. Bahamians who want to start their own businesses, who are thinking about venturing into something, they need to know that, one, the tax regime is not going to change on them in any willy-nilly way, because the government's borrowed too much money and now they need to recover more revenues. And so the only way to do that is to hike the VAT or introduce a new tax. So these are, this is why this is important. This is why it's important for the public and the citizens to be engaged in what the government's doing, because it really sets the tone for the way we operate, what we can expect, and also how we feel about the country. If I see the government investing in recreational facilities and parks and sidewalks, in good schools, in new schools, and in areas that I think will stimulate not just economic growth, but stimulate the potential of every Bahamian to achieve. And it's not, the resources aren't just going to certain segments of the society, that everybody has a fair chance and that everybody's needs are being taken care of. I think this is important. Now, I think we all realize that, resources are finite. No government actually has enough resources to do all the things that the citizens want. I would love to have, for example, a park in every neighborhood where there's a tennis court and there's a basketball court and where there's a swimming pool. But that's not, one, that takes a lot of maintenance. It takes a lot of resources to do that, but it's an aspiration, right? And I think Bahamians would love it if their neighborhoods, if they could walk out of their streets and go around the corner and there's a park, there's sidewalks that are safe, and there are recreational areas where children can play in a safe environment. So those kinds of amenities which we find when we travel, when we go to places, when we go outside of the Bahamas, and we land in cities typically, or not just cities, but also some small towns, we notice that, oh, there are nice places to sit and just have lunch or sit in a park and enjoy the scenery. It's safe to walk on the sidewalks. It's safe to walk in this neighborhood. I mean, these are aspirations that I think every citizen has. And when you travel, for those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to travel and see what some countries can provide, because one, they're collecting taxes, but two, there's a duty of care for the citizens. So, we want clean streets, we want our garbage collected on a regular basis. And this is why it's important to monitor waste in government, but also what I would call unproductive spending. So there are lots of ways in which the government, I think, can be very productive with its spending. And then there are other ways in which, it seems like it doesn't make any sense. So I think every Bahamian has these ideas in their heads, and I think they ought to be having these conversations with the people who come knocking on their doors, during the election period, and say, well, okay, what are you doing for me? I don't want a turkey from you. I want you to go to Parliament and advocate for sidewalks and clean streets and garbage collected on time and a safe environment for me. So we have to become, I think, more concerned about issues that in the long run make sense. And here I would say that particularly today where climate change and sustainability issues are extremely worrying globally, we ought to be looking through every single dollar that's spent in this country and say, is it being spent sustainably? Is that investment a sustainable one? Because if the answer is no, then it means it's a bad decision. And when I say, is it a sustainable, if you look at those expenditures through a sustainability filter, have we built that road, that building, that school, keeping in mind the fact that climate change is a threat, hurricanes are a threat, so those buildings need to be climate proofed. Have we thought about putting solar panels on our public buildings so that energy efficiency can be a goal that's attained? All of these issues become extremely important now because of climate change, which is something maybe 50 years ago we didn't think that much about. But now we have to think about it because it's a real and present threat. And given that we're now in hurricane season, it's one thing to be praying not to be hit, but it's another thing to actually be prepared for a natural disaster when it comes. And the only way to do that is to do the work first. So here is where I think we all need to be paying attention. And I mentioned at the beginning that a lot of what I just discussed, it's either in the Constitution or it's in our Financial Administration Audit Act, and it's in the Public Finance Management Act. So nothing is made up or just coming out of thin air, but there's actually a legal underpinning for the way the budget is presented, the way the process is designed, the way the information is supposed to be shared and published and shared with the public. And I think all of this information you can find on the org website. But a first step is just understanding or trying to understand better what it is that the government's doing with our resources, with your resources, with taxpayers' money. Just, holding them to account, because this is what good civil society does. So I think with that, Ari, I will stop and we can take questions, if there are any.
Yes, there are. Thank you so much, Therese, for that presentation. We did get a few questions at the beginning. And everyone, if you have other questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and I can ask them for you.
Okay, what are they?
So the first question we got is from Dylan Miles. He asks, is there some sort of gain for policymakers to pass a bill that worsens a debt situation?
Sorry, is there what?
He asked if there's some sort of gain for policymakers to pass a bill that worsens a debt situation. So we came out the gate swinging.
That worsens the debt situation. I mean, as I said, there are some things that we can't do without borrowing, right? So roadworks are really expensive, building schools are really expensive, building hospitals are really expensive. So we tend to have to borrow for those big ticket items. I think what we have to pay attention to is the fact that we do have a Financial Administration Audit Act, and the Public Finance Management Act, which is trying to keep the deficit on an annual basis within a certain range, and also keep the debt within a certain range, the debt to GDP ratio within a certain range. Now, in this recent budget, I think, if I can remember correctly, we heard the finance minister say that they've had to postpone when the debt to GDP ratio would come down to 60%. I think the date I have in my mind, which I recall, but I could be wrong, was something like 28, 29 budget. But I may be missing that. But I think the point, what the question is, no, there's nothing to gain, but there's hardly a way to finance infrastructure without borrowing, because our savings, public sector savings, which is, what we would have after we've taken out all of the spending, and we now from the revenues we've earned, and if there's savings there, and you will recall that this budget that we're into now is actually projecting a surplus by the end of the fiscal year, which would be June, by end of June in 2026. Now, the finance minister said that this will be the first time in forever that this has happened. But I think the risk for that projection right now is the state of the global economy and whether or not we're going to be hit by recession if the US goes into recession. So, here again, by the time we have the mid-year review of the budget, we'll be in a better position to know about that. But yeah, no, there's no, I don't think there's any particular gain to, proposing that you borrow money, except, and this is where it's important, there must be value for money when we're borrowing to pay for whatever asset we're trying to create. So whether it's a new school, a new airport, new roads, whatever that is that we're borrowing for, it must make sense. And this is where our procurement policies are very important, because our procurement policies should ensure that the public gets value for money. So, and this is the reason why, it seems onerous at the time, but we asked for 3 quotes for certain big spending. We need to put up requests for proposals, RFPs for certain types of projects of a certain size. International organizations that we work with or borrow from will request that these international procurement policies and guidelines be adhered to if you're borrowing from those institutions, IDB, World Bank, anyone else. So again, it's to ensure that we get value for money.
So another question from Philip Swan. You also mentioned that in lots of cases we don't qualify for certain loans. Does that mean that we also don't contribute? For example, the IMF and the World Bank.
So no, we definitely contribute. So the Bahamas is a member of the IMF. IMF has 184 member countries. The Bahamas definitely is one. And we know that because every year there's an Article 4 consultation. It's called a surveillance review that's done. I used to do this work when I worked at the IMF. And the Bahamas has never borrowed from the IMF because think about 25 years ago or even longer, the IMF had a very bad name, meaning if you were borrowing from the IMF, typically you were thought to be a basket case country. Now, during COVID and in periods of deep recession, like in 2008 and so on, there was a lot of motivation, I think, for small countries to borrow from the IMF. We actually contribute resources to the IMF. We paid a subscription. We're entitled to borrow from the IMF. We have not because I think it's just a mindset. It's a narrative around, oh, it's bad to borrow from the IMF. As someone who's worked for 20 years at the IMF, I can tell you there's absolutely no shame or no stigma attached to borrowing from the IMF today. And in fact, the IMF has created special products designed for countries like the Bahamas to deal with climate change and resilience and sustainability. And, it's entirely within, it would make sense to me if we needed to do some deep reforms to borrow from the IMF because and this is one of the reasons why countries don't like doing it. Typically, an IMF program comes with having to meet certain conditions. And those conditions could be something like reforming the public service or looking at the way the Bahamas collects revenues. I think most economists who would look at the Bahamian government budget today and look at the narrow base with which we have to earn revenue and say, oh my God, how does the government manage on that slim? Because our tax to GDP revenue is under 20%. That's a very, very low share of GDP for revenue for a country with the amount of needs that we have. So there is room for reform in our tax system, I think. And I know we don't like to talk about income tax, but if you look at countries around the world that provide the kinds of services that every Bahamian is crying out for, including me, like better welfare system, better care of our elderly, better care of our disabled communities, better hospitals, better clinics, better schools, you can only do that if you have revenue. And if you don't have revenue, then we're going to end up with what we have, which are, in my mind, less than optimal institutions that should generate, good educational returns for our investment. So I know Bahamians don't like to hear that our educational system is in a crisis, but it's not just the Bahamas education system that's in a crisis. The World Bank did a report earlier towards the end of last year, the beginning of this year, to say that the Caribbean's educational system is in a crisis. And I recognize this because I've studied this for a while, working at IDB and other places where, given the kinds of returns, and when I say returns, what our students are coming out with is suboptimal relative to the demands that we have in the labor market. And if you talk to anyone that's hiring Bahamians, they will tell you that certain skills are lacking. Those skills can only be provided for if we have a better educational system. And right now we do not. And I challenge anyone, and I think the Minister of Education knows this, but because education is expensive and because we don't have the revenue, we have what we have. So yeah, it's very complicated, but I think yeah, we need to do better.
So we have another question. In stage 5 of the government budget, which is evaluation, how are we assured that monies are being allocated as planned? I think this is meant to say what transparency mechanism is being used.
So I think the main one is just publication of the data when it should be available, right? So the government internally, every month they know what they've collected, and every month they know what they spend. Some governments are very transparent about this, and you can log into their websites and you can see almost in real time what's happening with the budget. I don't think we're there yet. While I think there have been improvements in what is being shared by the Ministry of Finance in the Bahamas, over time. There's more information being shared, but I think what we want is data to be available on a regular basis and in a format that everyone can understand. Like, I am a big fan of doing a citizen's budget, and by that I mean not a how long is this? I think it was 500 pages of all of the data in the budget document. It's a lot, and it's in a format that's not really friendly. So it's very difficult to say, oh, find what you're looking for in the budget. It's really difficult to do it. So I think what we need is a citizens-friendly budget, and that could be done in a whole various ways. And I've seen it done in some countries where there is a supplement in the newspaper where they break it down. They use a lot of graphics and they say, here's what we spent on housing, here's what we spent on schools, here's what we spent on airports and so on, roads and so on. And so you get a good sense of what was actually spent. Here's what we took in from VAT. Here's what we took in on income tax. Here's what we took in from XYZ. There are ways to do it. And I would encourage the finance officials to find ways to break down the budget so that it's more accessible. But for people who are policy wonks and who really need to dive into the data, it just means having the data presented on a timely basis so that decisions can be made. As I talked about, investors wanting to know what's going to happen. If you notice that the debt in country X is rising very fast, you're going to say, well, I don't think I want to invest in that country because I think they're going to be raising taxes tomorrow. And by the way, there's a good example of something that happened in this budget, or maybe the previous one. In today's newspaper, there's lots of comments about the taxation of the mariners and what that has done to the private yachting business, which mostly affects our family island communities. And there was a lot of discussion, a lot was shared by the writer that talked about not having consultation with the marine community to say, all right, here these new taxes are coming, these new fees are coming in. I think in some cases the fees increased by 100%. And we think that the Bahamas may be the only place someone wants to dock their yachts, but we're not. There are other places they can go, and they're choosing to do that. So the impact of that 100% increase on a fee may not have been anticipated, or the research that went into why we should increase the fees by 100% may not have been done thoroughly. And here is where, again, why it's important for us to be engaged is because if you're going to do that, have a conversation with me. As the community that will be the recipient of these higher costs, you want to talk about that first. So I think there are some ways in which, if it's not done properly, the budget can come to bite us in places we don't want because we haven't done enough work or we haven't had enough consultation with the communities who may be on the receiving end of either the higher fees or the increased taxes or whatever. But people pay attention. And because business margins, all right, we're starting to come out of our post-COVID gloom as an economy, but things are still not quite where it ought to be, and our growth rate is not particularly fast. So anything less than 3% is not a great growth rate, and we're under 2% growing per year. So I think we need to be careful, and that's where the consultation, I think, is really important.
So we have another question. What are some buzzwords that policymakers may use in the House, or ones that can shift focus away from parts of the budget that we should be looking at? And what do they mean? And they gave an example of the trickle-down effect.
Right, yeah. So I mentioned the trickle-down effect and how that doesn't work. I mean, trickle-down, I think in the Bahamas doesn't really make much sense. I mean, we're not a country that has a super, a lot of billionaires that we can sort of tap into. That's not our reality. It's not like the U.S. where the view of a particular party is by allowing the investor class to have pay no taxes, whether it's Amazon or Ford or any major corporation, to not be paying taxes, but to be levying really high taxes on the poor and the middle class. Those are very different scenarios, particularly since we don't have income tax. So that's a concept that really doesn't apply. I think distractions are probably around some of the things that had my mind going a little bit was, the tax reliefs on X, Y, Z. Are we going to cut this? And we're going to cut that. We're going to cut this. What was not, and what I would like to see as an economist is for everything that's cut, and even for everything that we're now going to be spending it on Y, we ought to be able to say, we're going to save 1%, 5%, 2%, whatever. It ought to be acknowledged in the document. So when we're cutting, we should also be saying, and it's going to cost us X, or it's going to cost us Y. So it's one thing, it's because it's all, again, it's a projection. It's by saying, these are people who haven't bought the new refrigerators yet, or the new energy efficient, whatever. And now you will have a discount on that. But what will that actually cost in terms of lost revenue? So I think this is where you become a little bit skeptical. And always, I think budgets tend to be overly optimistic in terms of revenues. So looking at, what are the projected increase in the VAT, while looking at what is accrued to the budget so far this year, the same parameters may not exist next year because of all of the external global shocks that I mentioned earlier. Other thing that may come to haunt us in the coming 6 months, 12 months is higher prices of oil because of conflict that's happening around the world. So we're seeing oil prices already rising because of the Iran conflict and how far those oil prices will go. Because we can't do anything without electricity, and because we have not switched over to renewable energy yet, then we know that we will continue to be plagued by high oil prices. And high oil prices feed into every single price everywhere else, because transportation, our goods come by whatever. Nothing can operate without electricity, including water. So all of that is likely to be another downside risk that we ought to be thinking about.
So with international fiscal and monetary institutions like the EU blacklist and the IMF, what are some of the issues that the country would face if we receive a negative rating?
So the first impact of a negative rating basically means a downgrade. So what happens with downgrades is that it becomes much more expensive to borrow on capital markets. So let's say we can borrow now at 8%. I'm just being hypothetical. Let's say we're borrowing now at 8% with our current credit rating. If we were downgraded, we may have to borrow at 10%. So it just becomes more expensive. And it doesn't just become expensive for the government, the whole country becomes more expensive. Because a credit rating, a sovereign credit rating, also affects the price that any investor trying to borrow or raise money will. Everybody pays a higher interest rate once a credit rating is downgraded. So that's the risk of that. What I always think about with a credit rating is why I think it's useful to have credit ratings. And I'm glad that we're now expanded beyond S&P, Fitch, and Moody's. And now I think they added one more. Moody's, we had Moody's and S&P, and now maybe we have Fitch. But there's a lot of information embedded in the narrative of every credit rating. So if you read the reports of the ratings when they're issued, there is usually a section that says, we would consider raising the rating, or the Bahamas could get a higher rating if it did 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And typically countries look at those, the narrative and say, oh, okay, well, we could do those 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So the next time when you come to do the rating next year, we can say, look, we took your advice and we've now done A, B, C, D, and G. And so what do you think? So, and those, dealing with rating agencies may seem like a scary thing, but actually it's an opportunity to have a good conversation with a neutral party. And by neutral, I mean, they're doing this for lots of countries around the world. They don't particularly care about the Bahamas. And what I always say to countries is that it's about math, right? If things don't add up, your credit rating will be downgraded. And by that, I mean, the risks that are associated with a country like the Bahamas have gotten a lot higher because of climate change. So all around the world now, central banks are starting to look at climate risk as a potential, there's a major factor in trying to come up with good monetary policy. And the same with fiscal policy in countries around the world. It's something new. It's something that we've had to deal with, let's say, with growing importance over the last decade. But if Fitch, Moody's, S&P cannot locate anywhere in the government policy what the Bahamas government is doing to mitigate the impact of climate change, that's already giving you some negative marks on the credit rating. So again, here is where having a disaster risk management unit or ministry or whatever we want to call it, that is actually working on policies and ways in which we can improve building codes, our ability to bounce back after a hurricane, because we now have, whether it's contingent credit lines that we have with the IDB, or whether we've taken out a cat bond with the World Bank, they want to see that we have insurance in the event that the natural disaster is going to happen. It will happen. We know it's going to happen. It's a matter of time. Since Dorian, I think we've been fairly lucky not to have a Category 5 hurricane. But given the way the climate is heating up and the way the world is going, we know that this is a clear present danger for the country. So any finance minister in the Bahamas needs to be constantly thinking about these issues. It would keep me up at night if I didn't have a proper disaster management strategy in place, and if I didn't have insurance. And by insurance, I mean, all right, we are members of CRIF, which is the Caribbean Risk Reduction Insurance Facility. We have insured the country for certain kinds of shocks. We have the contingent facility with the IDB, but maybe there are other things we can do. But in terms of making sure that we do sensible development policies, like we need to think about our coastlines. We need to think about mangrove restoration. We need to think about, fossil fuel, lessening our dependence on fossil fuels and more renewable energy. There are a whole host of things that we can be doing to shore up the country against climate change. And the credit rating agencies look for those policies to be there before they would say, okay, we can give you 2 more marks up. So this is why I think they're important, credit rating agencies. And again, every Bahamian, when those reports come out, should say, okay, how are we doing? Is it a stable outlook? Is it a positive outlook? Are we getting downgraded, and why? And don't just sort of take what comes from the minister when the ratings come out, but do your own research and go and read the reports itself, because they're accessible. They're accessible.
So we're going to take 2 more questions. One of them being, is there an optimal amount of benefit that the government should receive based on what is contributed to international organizations, in particular development funding entities?
I mean, I don't know. Optimal is, so let's take the ones that we are members of. IMF, we're not taking any advantage of, and I think that could be fixed. The World Bank, we are a member of. We have taken advantage of in the past. IDB and the Bahamas have had a really good relationship for a long time. IDB has financed roads, education reform, lots of things in the Bahamas. The contingent credit facility, post-Dorian, they helped out a lot. That money was drawn down under the contingent credit facility. That's the disaster insurance that I talked about. Optimal is relative, because each of these organizations, now CAF, we've joined the Latin American Development Bank called CAF. I think our subscription was something like $25 million. What's optimal? What's optimal is being able to, in my opinion, max out on any financing for development through these institutions before going to commercial banks or the capital markets. And by that, I mean, before we go to JP Morgan or Oppenheimer or Credit Suisse, let's figure out, can we get financing from the IDB? Can we get the financing from the World Bank? And the other reason I say that is always the financing from these institutions comes with a lot of technical advice. And I think most people would know that the IDB has a pretty big office here in Nassau with experts who are sitting in that office who can help us figure things out. IDB, for example, worked on the Bahamas procurement legislation. So there's a lot of advice that is easily and readily available through these institutions. So there, I would say that that's the optimal, the sweet spot for being a member of one of these institutions is the extent to which we are exploiting their brains and their technical expertise as well as their finances. So it's not just about, all right, I want to borrow because I need to build a road, but what kind of road do you want to build? And here is where you're going to get the best advice. We want to do renewable energy projects, energy efficiency projects. The IDB has absolutely some of the best brains around how to do this. And the same with the World Bank. So I think this is where sometimes we have to step outside of our own, what I would call ego, to recognize what we don't know and to ask for the right advice. And the beauty of these institutions is that, one, they cover many countries. They've seen lots of different issues, lots of challenges, lots of problems, lots of solutions that have been applied to similar problems across the globe. And hence they can come up with a pretty decent solution for the Bahamas. So that would be my response.
Thanks, Therese. We actually just got one. Actually, I think I'll answer this last question,
Sure.
and it's surrounding transparency. So Org is an advocate for better transparency in all of our systems here in the Bahamas. Aside from the Be Clear initiative, we're a big proponent for FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, which was passed but unfortunately never enacted. So yeah, we're definitely an advocate for transparency in all of our systems. I think that we can cap the Q&A session right here. I'm loving how engaged everyone is. We're definitely going to be hosting more of these sessions. So if you have additional questions that you would like to ask, please feel free to reach out to me so that I can answer them for you. And for anyone who maybe missed the beginning or is just joining, I just want to say that you can definitely get involved in this government budgeting process by checking out the resources that we have available on orgbahamas.com/b-clear-bahamas/, which I know is a mouthful. So what I'll do is I'll type it in the chat so that you can have access to the resources that we've put on the website. And like I said earlier, we are also looking to partner with civic groups in order to host this presentation in the community. So if you or someone you know is affiliated with a civic group that would be interested in having their members learn about how we can get engaged with the government's budget, then please let me know. My name is Ariana Wells. My number is 432-3397. I'll also put that information in the chat. And I just want to say again, thank you so much, Therese, for your time today. This has been an incredible opportunity to connect economists with this topic back into the people and helping the people to understand the complexities of the national budget, because it is something that's very relevant right now. And Org is definitely, we have the honor of being able to lead this project and this program and include people in this process. So thank you all very much for joining us today. And I also want to shout out Matt, our executive director, who has been here in the chat. I see him dropping the links right now, as well as our senior manager for operations, Vanessa Bethel, has been in here as well. So thank you all so much. We're a tiny but mighty team, and slowly but surely we're getting it all done. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Ari. Bye.